You remember Wii Sports on Christmas morning, Hannah Montana on a Friday night, Club Penguin, your first online world, with a username nobody knew was you, Webkinz codes, silly bands up to your elbow, Drake and Josh, iCarly, The Sweet Life. You remember getting your first phone in 7th or 8th grade. Not a brick, not a flip, an actual smartphone, and understanding immediately that everything had just changed in a way you couldn't fully articulate. You remember Justin Bieber's Baby playing in every hallway of your middle school. You remember Vine before TikTok made everyone forget it existed. You remember when Instagram was just photos with filters and nobody had figured out how to make it feel like a competition yet. You remember your early 20s, the years that were supposed to be the most important, the most alive, the most fully yours, disappearing into a pandemic that canceled everything and sent you home to a version of the world that nobody had planned for. Here's the thing about people born between 1995 and 1000. You are technically 90s kids, technically millennials, technically the generation that had it all figured out before Gen Z arrived. But none of those labels have ever fit you cleanly. The millennial experience, dial-up internet, AIM away messages, a childhood without a smartphone, coming of age before social media, that isn't quite yours. And Gen Z, growing up from birth inside TikTok and algorithms, that isn't quite yours either. You exist in the gap between two of the most defined generations in modern history, and psychology has something very specific to say about what that does to a person. When millennials talk about their defining childhood experiences, recording songs off the radio, Napster, AIM screen names, a world before Google, you recognize the references, but you're just outside them. You were too young. Those things were ending as you were beginning. You inherited the aesthetic, but you weren't fully inside the era. When Gen Z talks about growing up entirely inside social media, inside smartphones, inside algorithms from early childhood, that's not quite you either. You remember a version of childhood before all of that. Not clearly, not in detail, but it's there. A before. A texture of childhood that existed before the phone in your pocket became the organizing center of everything. You have spent most of your life in a generational no man's land. Too young to fully claim the millennial experience, too old to fully claim Gen Z. The cultural touchstones that defined both groups, on one side and the other, are both slightly off. You know every reference. You belong to none of the eras completely. What you are is something more specific than either label captures. And the psychology of existing at a generational boundary, with just enough memory of the before to feel the loss of it, and just enough exposure to the after to be shaped by it, is something that researchers are only recently beginning to document properly. In the study of generational psychology, the term for what this cohort experienced is cohort displacement, the condition of identifying with a cultural moment you were born at the edge of, rather than the center of. You are nostalgic for a version of childhood that was partly real and partly inherited. You watched older siblings and cousins live experiences that ended just before you arrived. Your earliest cultural memories are from a decade you were too young to consciously inhabit. And yet the 90s identity, the cartoons, the music, the specific texture of that decade, shaped you anyway. Through older kids, through reruns, through the tail end of things that were already becoming memories by the time you were old enough to remember them. But the more consequential piece of your psychology is not the nostalgia. It is what happened during your adolescence. You are the first cohort in history to have gone through the entirety of high school, all 4 years, with a smartphone in your pocket. Not older millennials who got phones in college after their identities were mostly formed. Not younger Gen Z who had tablets in early childhood before they could form complex thoughts. You specifically, old enough to remember without the phone, young enough to have done all of your adolescent identity formation completely inside it. That combination, a faint, pre-digital childhood memory, followed by a fully digital adolescence, produced something specific. A generation that is simultaneously nostalgic for simplicity and completely fluent in technology, that understands both worlds without fully belonging to either. In 2017, psychologist Jean Twenge published iGen, a decade-long study of generational mental health trends based on data from millions of American teenagers. The finding that made headlines was a specific number, the birth year 1995. Twenge identified 1995 as the inflection point, The year after which teenagers showed a sharp, consistent rise in depression, anxiety, loneliness, and social disconnection. Not a gradual drift, a measurable break in the data, beginning with the cohort born that year, corresponding precisely with the rise of smartphone ownership and social media use among teenagers. Between 2010 and 2015, when this cohort was 11 to 20 years old, rates of major depressive episodes among teenagers rose by 52%. Feelings of loneliness, purposelessness, and social exclusion increased across the board. The teenagers who showed the steepest decline in well-being were the ones spending the most time on social media, which was, by that point, every teenager. The 1995 to 1999 cohort didn't just grow up during this shift. They were its first subjects. They were the teenagers in the data, and unlike younger Gen Z, who entered that environment from early childhood with no alternative baseline, this cohort had just enough memory of a different kind of adolescence. Slower, less observed, less measured, to feel the contrast, even if they couldn't name it. You grew up in the most psychologically demanding adolescent environment ever documented, and you did it during the years when the tools being used on you were still new enough that nobody fully understood what they were doing. Here is what the in-between position actually built. You are fluent in more cultural languages than almost any cohort around you. You understand the millennial experience well enough to speak it. You understand the Gen Z experience well enough to navigate it. You move between those two worlds with a natural ease that people on either side of the border don't have, because they only know one side. You are also more adaptable than you give yourself credit for, because you have spent your entire life adapting to a childhood that didn't have a clean generational label, to an adolescence that was building itself around you in real time, to a world that kept rearranging the rules before you could memorize them. Adapting is not a skill you had to develop. It is the thing your entire developmental timeline required of you from the beginning. And you carry something that neither the generation before you nor the one after you possesses in the same form. The lived memory of the transition itself. Not the before, not the after. The moment when everything changed. The before and after exists in your memory simultaneously, because you were there at the exact moment it happened. That is not a small thing to carry. Most people live entirely in one era. You lived across the seam. There is one more thing that needs to be said about this specific birth window. You were supposed to have your early 20s. That is not a small sentence. The years between 20 and 25 are, by nearly every measure in developmental psychology, the most formative adult years a person has. The years for building the version of life that will carry everything that comes after. The first job that means something. The relationships that stick. The city, the apartment, the sense of a future that finally feels like yours. For the 1995 to 1999 cohort, those years were interrupted by a pandemic that canceled gatherings, closed cities, ended jobs, and sent people home to rooms they had already left behind. You were 20 to 24 when COVID hit, at the exact age when presence matters most, when showing up, being in rooms, building things side by side is how adult life actually gets built. The world went quiet and asked you to wait. You waited. You adapted. You rebuilt. You found ways to do things that had never been done the way you had to do them, in conditions nobody had prepared you for, at an age when most generations before you were simply living. That adaptation was not incidental. It was the thing your entire generational experience had been training you for without telling you. The in-between childhood, the transitional adolescence, the world that kept changing the rules. You were built, whether you chose it or not, for exactly the kind of disruption that arrived when it did. The late 90s kids are not the forgotten generation. They are the generation that was asked to be flexible their entire lives, and figured out how to be. If this describes something you felt but never heard named, subscribe. The next video goes into a part of this generation's psychology that almost nobody has addressed directly. If this one landed, the next one will too.